All right, so today I'm going to talk a little bit about my progress learning Latin for the first 30 days learning Latin. And hopefully you find it entertaining and interesting. I have my own perspectives on language learning, and hopefully it's good. And I'll talk a little bit about my process, my progress, my difficulties, and just how it's going. So, a little bit of background, I do have a little bit of language learning experience. I spent a little over 3 years learning French to a pretty decent level on my own, just as an adult. I can read books very, very well, understand. My listening comprehension is very high. Things like podcasts and YouTube, near 100%, sometimes literally 100%, like word for word exactly. Sometimes I might miss a word here and there every few minutes, but sometimes it's literally just 100%. TV and film, also pretty good, depending on the show. Sometimes it's 100%, sometimes it's a little bit less, but overall pretty solid. My speaking, writing, it's okay. It's like passable, it's usable. It's like probably B2 level-ish, just because I've just hardly ever practiced it. But I have enough language in me that if I actually practice it and focus on getting better, I could speak and write pretty well. So that was my experience learning French, and so I was excited to learn Latin and see what the experience of that would be like, how it would be different from French. And the idea of like a case system I thought was very interesting, and the idea that it's a written language spanning over 2,000 years, which is really cool. And I like the idea of just trying something new. And one thing I've noticed is it gives me a new perspective and appreciation of my French language learning. Sometimes it's very easy to get tunnel vision when you're learning a language, and especially when you're learning it to a pretty high level, I would say. And you lose sight of how much progress you actually made, and appreciating it. Okay, so the question is, how am I learning Latin? So the language textbook that everyone recommends on the internet is called Familia Romana. And excuse my Latin pronunciation. I wouldn't say it's very good. Try my best, but one thing I definitely can't do yet is the double R. In French we have the uvular fricative, ch, camarade, whereas in I don't know if this is a Spanish word or Italian word, but yeah, like we do the tap R, at least at one R, camarade, romana. But then there's also the rolling R where you do like kind of your tongue goes like with air is how I assume it's done, but I can't do that. Per, can't do it yet. I'm sure I'll get there eventually, but excuse my pronunciation, especially my long vowels, short vowels, etc. I do my best, but can't say I'm great at it yet. Anyways, Familia Romana is the textbook that everyone recommends to learn Latin with, and the basic idea is that you read through the text. You don't use English whatsoever. You have pictures, you have other explanations, and just through reading, just through the pictures, you can slowly start picking up the language. Anyways, and so this is the very first chapter. Roma in Italia est. Italia in Europa est, etc. Again, I don't think my pronunciation is very good, but and then little by little, just by reading the story, you learn the vocabulary, you learn the grammar very naturally. And that's the theory, at least. Now, the reality, I think, is more complicated and not quite as clean as it's made out to be. So in this first chapter, it's very simple, right? Like est, for example, is literally in French. It doesn't sound like it's pronounced completely differently, but it's basically the same word. It means the same thing. If you just rearrange the words a little bit, it makes perfect sense. So Rome is in Italy. Okay, Roma in Italia est. And then little by little, then you read the next one, Italia in Europa est. So again, you can assume that Europa means Europe, and Graecia means Greece, etc. And little by little, you look at the map, you look at the explanations, and slowly you start picking up the language, and it introduces vocabulary slowly and the grammar, etc. So that's the story, and it's definitely true for the first chapter or two, but in reality, it's more complicated because oftentimes, number one, the story is not very good. I don't care who you are. Like, maybe if you've never read a story before, maybe this would be considered a good story. But I mean, like, most of the book is not much of a story. It's like, oh, let's talk about your body, Johnny. Like, you have a head and you have two legs. What's on the end of your legs? Are there two hands? No, there are 2 feet. Like that kind of stuff. Like a good chunk of the book is that. Like, oh, you have an uncle in the military. He carries a sword. What else does he carry? He carries a shield. he lives in Germany. Like you get that kind of stuff. And like that's not a story. Like I don't know what stories you read, but story tends to have conflict and plot and developments and drama. And there is some there, admittedly, right? There's like a slave that runs away from the family and he finds his lover in Rome and they sneak away to in a boat all the way to Greece. And one of the sons is a bad student and he gets hit by his teacher, and then there's drama there and he gets into a fight. And but come on, like as a story, no one is reading this as entertainment, even though some people claim that. It's just like, again, I'm just like, it scratches my head. Like maybe it's entertaining compared to, say, memorizing declension tables or verb endings, but it's not like a good story but in and of itself. It's a frame device to teach grammar and vocabulary, if we're being brutally honest. Because again, like as I mentioned, sometimes there are just tons of vocabulary dumps. So let's talk about the human body. There's a head, there are feet, here are your lungs, here's your liver, like that kind of thing. Like literally like that. You're not like, what I expected when I started this book it would be something like, oh, I'm feeling bad today, and then like a doctor would come in, oh, your liver is what's wrong, and then below your liver, your stomach is also feeling a little sick, like that, more like that. Even though that's a little artificial, at least like a little more naturally as like an actual story, where it's like we got to go to the doctor to fix our liver. It's like, here's your medicine, put it in your mouth and swallow it, like that kind of thing. Like tell the story and using the vocabulary incidentally, and then repetition, etc. Like that's what I expected it to be, but it's not. Like to some extent, it's basically a grammar textbook, but with a story frame device, which maybe that's just what everyone thinks it is. And I'm not breaking new ground making this argument, but a lot of the time it's like, all right, we're going to teach the nominative case in this first chapter. So we're just going to talk about it in every which way, in every combination possible. All right, this chapter we're going to talk about the passive tense and some common forms of that. And then we'll do like every possible variation with pronouns and different nouns and stuff, every different possible angle to deal with that grammar concept. And then the next chapter will do something different, which is not what I expected. I expected it again to just be a natural story, and then these grammar concepts would be little by little sprinkled in very naturally. And it's really not. It's overtly not. Like again, like I said, like I'm not joking when I say there's the chapter where it's just talking about the human body for pages on end. Let's see if I can find it. So again, this like the first 2 pages are literally just like vocabulary info dumps talking about the different parts of the body, the chest, the stomach, the feet, and just like not in any kind of story, just talking about it. Or again, there's like another chapter I mentioned, like there's an uncle who lives in Germany and he's a soldier there. But do they tell a story of the uncle who's like gets into a battle with like barbarians and has to run away and goes back to the military camp and they throw spears at them, or he has to hide in like the trenches to escape, or behind a tree or something? Like, do they tell a story like that? You'd think they would, but no, they just are like, yep, we have an uncle, he lives in Germany, he has a sword. It's not as long as the barbarian sword, and he's very brave, like that. Like, come on, like you have the tools, why not tell a story with this? And that's one of the criticism, I guess. And again, related to that, so there's one that they just dump a lot of vocabulary on you very quickly. That is a little frustrating. Sometimes multiple new words per sentence, per phrase. There'll be like a phrase and there'll be 3 new words. Like why? Like why would you do that? There's no justification for that. Unless you're talking about the very, very beginning. Like, yeah, occasionally once in a while, you might be forced to have like a couple words that in a comprehensible context, you'd have to have 2 words that haven't been introduced before. I get it. It's possible, just inevitability. But, ideally you'd use cognates if you could. But it's like very common that there would just be sentences with multiple new words you'd have to learn, and it's just very awkward. Related to that is grammar. So then, like I mentioned before, each chapter will be focused on a specific grammatical concept and then like drill it essentially with every different possible combination from like passive and active, or every different pronoun, etc. And again, it's very unnatural because that's not how language is. When we read a story, we're not like, we get a chapter just randomly, every sentence has the passive form in it. Now, again, I'm sure that is a very common thing in Latin, the passive, and much more common than it does technically exist in French and English, but much less common, from what I can guess. But still, it's like this feeling of drilling the concept rather than just telling a story naturally where the concepts come up. Like there's a benefit to that in the sense that you get a lot of practice with the concept and you get a lot of chance to understand it. But at the same time, if you don't get it, the story is just going to be incomprehensible, and like you're just like not going to understand like what they're even talking about, which is very frustrating. Which again, and it's a very different experience than reading a story where like the grammar is laid out in almost statistical distribution so that the most common grammatical concepts, like say the accusative, like it's going to be in almost every sentence, right? More or less, or it's going to be extremely common at the very least, and you're gonna get that pretty quick, right? It's like you can't understand a sentence without understanding that this thing is doing the action to this thing, and like it's a concept that happens so often, you're going to internalize it very quickly. Whereas the rarer concepts that are like showing up in a medium frequency or rare frequency, it's going to take longer to appreciate. But because they're medium or rare, it's not so bad. But if you just throw a concept at a student where it's like it's like you either understand it or you don't. And if you don't understand it, it's very frustrating because you can't just skip over it, because they're just going to drill it again and again and again until you finally get it. And this drilling mindset, I think, is the biggest issue I have with Familia Romana. It's just very much drilling the grammar. And this relates to the pensa and the other exercises where it's like we need to learn the future or the past infinitive, and we're going to learn all these different verbs with the past infinitive, and you're going to drill it and know it. And that's the sense I get from the textbook, where instead of just naturally in a normal context, just introduce it, and then the students will slowly pick it up over time. So that's frustrating. And again, it comes down to this like sort of drilling mindset versus acquisition mindset, I think, even though it's sort of supposedly the natural method. That's the thing. So it's a boring story with too much vocab given at once, with drilling the vocabulary. And so is it the most perfect pedagogical tool? I don't think so. I think people way overpraise this book. Now, that being said, it's good. Like, it really is a really good book in the sense that it covers all the topics in a relatively natural way, in a naturally comprehensible context with a somewhat engaging story. So I don't want to over criticize it because it is very good, but I think it's overpraised as well as like this perfect pedagogical tool, which definitely is not. I think it's very old fashioned. There's like stereotypical depictions of women and girls, I think, in general, which is annoying. And I know you could say like, oh, that's just how they depicted them in ancient Rome. That's just what people were like back then. I think it's kind of a weak argument, but whatever. So again, I think it's good. I think it's a good resource. It's just, I think it is certainly not perfect, that's for sure. But again, I don't treat it as like, I'm not going to learn the language through Familia Romana. I know people talk about it like almost like once you've mastered the textbook, you know the language. But it's like there's 20,000 words, something like that, in the textbook. That's like that's not even a grain of sand in the desert of Latin. It's like an atom inside the grain of sand. I read 7 million words in French, and I feel like I still have a long way to go in terms of getting that level to the next level. And I imagine it would take much more than that in Latin, because it's different, much more different than English compared to French. And so 20,000 words is, again, a drop in the ocean, drop in the universe in terms of the content you'll have to get through to learn the language. So I just treat it as training wheels. I treat it as like just learn enough vocabulary, enough grammar concepts so that intermediate text can start to be comprehensible. I can understand the story and start learning more vocab, and start some of these grammar concepts that maybe I'm vaguely aware of in Familia Romana, but it hasn't like clicked in yet quite. They'll eventually click, and they will, because that's just the nature of language. We expose ourselves to language, and we will learn the language. We'll absorb it unconsciously and be able to produce it. Another thing that I think people talk about is that you should never translate, never, ever, ever, because we want to read it in Latin and understand it in Latin. But again, it's like there's nothing wrong with using a dictionary. Like, just look up the word in the dictionary. If it's like, for example, here, corpus. Now, I know what that means. You might not know it if your native language is English, but it means it's very similar in French. It's the body, right? The body, the human body, has four, I don't know, what do you call them, members? I know what they mean. I don't know if we have words for that in English. I'm sure we do. But yeah, so like that word, maybe you don't know, and maybe I'm sure it has cognates in English, but maybe you just don't recognize it. And like looking up and see that corpus means body. Like, there is nothing wrong with that. Like, that is a very quick and efficient way of learning the word. Now, you're not going to fully learn the word by the word and the translation. Of course not, right? You learn it by reading an incredible number of sentences that incorporate the word, and you understand the nuances of it, and you understand it purely as a concept rather than a pure translation. But as an initial first step to memorize the word, and to the first steps towards acquiring the word in the Stephen Krashen sense, it's totally fine. Like, again, just we have these tools. We have dictionaries. You can translate it. You can actually learn it in Latin if your vocabulary is good enough. But there's nothing wrong with using dictionaries. You don't have to read the chapter 50 times so that you eventually absorb this vocabulary. That's silly. That's inefficient. And related to that, we have a wonderful program called Anki. It's been around for a long time. We have vocabulary in a way as a solved problem. We just put words in Anki, Some words will stick, some won't, but it's a very efficient way of learning your vocabulary, or at least speeding up the process. So to give you a demonstration, this is the first card I made, sunt. So it means are, or to be, plural, okay? And so what I did is I have the target word that I'm trying to memorize in the front, and on the back I have what it means in English, and then underneath that I have the sentence it came from, the Latin sentence. Now, originally when I was first doing this, I was putting the English, but I only did this for the very, like 5 or 6 cards. I hardly did this, because if I'm getting this from Lingua Latina, Persa Illustrata, Familia Romana, it's going to be a pretty comprehensible sentence in general. Sometimes these sentences are a little wonky, but in terms of when they're first introduced. But whatever. Yeah, so in this context, the way I would study now would be I'd read the word. I think, like, what does this mean? Either the English translation or just the general concept, like visualize it or something like that. And then I check the back. Does my visualization or translation make sense? And then I read the sentence. Do I understand the sentence? And then if it all checks out, good. I pass it. I try not to be too picky about if I understood it. Do I understand every tiny little nuance of the word? Don't worry too much about that, but as long as I understand it generally, I consider that a pass. And yeah, that's it. Originally, when I was first learning the vocabulary, I would literally just read the word and then just try and remember the translation. I wouldn't really read the sentence too much, because at the very beginning, any Latin sentence was extremely mentally taxing. It was very difficult to read. Like, I could read it, it would just be very, like, it would take so much mental energy. So I would just do read the Latin word and then the English translation. But now that I can read simple sentences with much less energy, I read the sentence on the back every single time. I think that's much better, because it, first of all, makes it more likely you'll absorb it in an unconscious way, and actually acquire the language. It also reinforces other words that are in the sentence. It'll help you memorize other words. And finally, yeah, that's pretty much it, I guess. Just it helps acquire the word in general in more natural context, so you're getting that acquisitional benefit of actually getting sentences in your eyes and your brain, rather than just the individual words. I think it'll stick much better. Okay. So if we just flip to some recent cards, what's one of my latest ones I made? So this one is convertit, which is to, like, turn over. So in this context, it's Quintus, who's sick. He's laying in bed. So this is the boy who's sick, again and again, is lying on his bed. Superlectum, he's on top of his bed, turning himself over. Okay, so that's a very awkward translation, but I don't really translate it. I just try to do my best to understand it. And sometimes I'll put the dictionary form of the word. And what's interesting in Latin is that they always put the first person singular indicative as the dictionary form of the verb, which is very different from, say, French, where they use the infinitive. So in French, say, the difference, so to go in French would be aller, whereas the first person would be vais, je vais. So if we're putting the things in the dictionary, like in French as we would in Latin, you put vais as the dictionary form. And whereas actually we put the infinitive aller. And there's only one infinitive in French versus the other forms like there is in Latin. But in Latin, it's different. I guess this comes from the Greeks, that they always would put the first person singular indicative as the dictionary form of the verb. And, infinitive would be part of the verb, or what it means, the different forms, but it wouldn't be like, that's not the default. And so it's cool. I've never seen that before, so that's neat. So I always put the dictionary form. I don't know if it helps that much, but I think it helps. Convertit, to turn over, and then the dictionary form converto. And then I would read the sentence, try to understand it. So yeah, that's it. And I think it's very effective. I think I've been learning the vocabulary very quickly. How many words do I learn a day? I learn 20 a day, which is quite a lot. In fact, I would say I wouldn't recommend that for most people, because I think you have to have a lot of either certain learning preference, or maybe you have a lot of experience with Anki to know what you're getting into. But for most people, 20 is probably too much. Probably 5 to 10 is much better. Maybe start with 5, maybe even 3 if you want to just get started with it. Yeah, so just 20 is a lot. I tried through 30 once for like a week to see, because I had a kind of a backlog of vocabulary, and 30 was way too much. There's always stories online where it's like, oh, I'm going to learn a ton of words per day, and you always end up regretting it. And I ended up regretting it, because 20 is fine, but 30 is just way too much. So let's look at some statistics of my Anki. So today I started 141 cards. The good rule of thumb is if you learn 20 a day, you'll end up every day studying 7 times that amount, because you don't just study it once. With the spaced repetition system, the first time you study it, you get it right, and then it'll wait a day, and then you study it, and if you get it right, it'll wait 3 days, and then 7, and then 3 weeks, and then 6 weeks, and 3 months, etc. So it keeps on spreading it out as a way to be efficient in terms of memorizing the words. And so you'll find is that the good rule of thumb is if you learn 20 a day, you'll end up studying about 140 cards per day. If you do 10, it would be 70 per day, 5, 35, etc. So don't go nuts with the new cards. It may seem fine the first day, but it'll bite you in the butt eventually. So start with 5 or 10. Just if you're new to Anki, 20 I would say is probably the maximum for anyone, no matter what language you're learning, is my opinion. So here I spend about 8 seconds per card, which is pretty speedy, I would say. And keeping it under 10 I think is important, and that's including reading the sentence. So some people can get under 5 if they're just reading the word and trying to get the translation, but I think you're going to get much more benefit if you read the sentence as well, especially if it's a very simple sentence. That small amount of extra input I think does help. I'm actually at 5 weeks of Anki, which is cool. So this is my deck. I have 20 new cards left. So these are cards that I have not actually studied yet, but I have made. I make all my cards myself, so I should probably make new cards today. I've got 540 cards that I have studied, but the young just means that the interval between when I study it is less than 3 weeks. So, I might see a card in 2 weeks, for example. And mature cards means that the intervals between when they're actually studied are pretty long, I think beyond 3 weeks. Okay, so I already have 192. Which is cool. Those ones are very easy because they're words that showed up at the beginning. And I've got 25 suspended. So the default Anki, I don't know what the default Anki setting is, but if you make a mistake too many times on a card, like if you forget it too many times, it'll automatically suspend the card, which means that it takes it out of the study rotation forever. You can add it back in if you like, but the idea is these are called leeches, words that for whatever reason they don't quite stick in your brain, and you keep on forgetting them. And they're called leeches because a small number of cards tend to cause disproportionate amount of problems when we memorize them. So 25 out of 777, those are like a tiny number, but they're, for whatever reason, very challenging to remember, that they just don't stick for some reason. And my threshold for getting rid of them out of my deck is 3. You can adjust this to whatever you want, but maybe the default is 5 or 6, but I put it at 3 because if I forget it 3 times, it's not worth worrying about, because the vast majority of words I can memorize, and I won't mess up more than a couple times. So that's what I recommend, by the way. So I would say just set your leash threshold to 3. If it gets suspended, don't worry about it because it's going to come up again. It's probably going to be if it's coming from Familia Romana, it's probably a very common word. It's going to come up eventually. You will eventually get it, so you don't have to worry about those words. Just let them go. It's better to learn 1,000 words and then forget 100, so you end up with a net of 900 words memorized, versus 100 words and you memorize every single one perfectly. That's 800 less words. Those 800 words you could have memorized if you just were less of a perfectionist. So I would say don't be a perfectionist with Anki. 3% is fine to throw away if they don't stick, and just try to memorize the ones that do stick. And my percentage, I think today was the first day I ever actually studied a mature card, so they were really easy, like sunt and quoque, etc. And so I got 100% of those. That's not normal, but here, so young cards are just the cards that I've studied before, but the intervals are less than 3 weeks. And 89%, very, very normal. You kind of want between 85 and 90% typically. I mean, it's okay if it's more than that, but you shouldn't be targeting that. Like, again, some people stress that out, like they're like, oh, I need to memorize every word perfectly. But again, eventually you're going to memorize all the words. Like if you just keep on exposing yourself to Latin, all the words you'll memorize, at least all the common words. But at the beginning, when you're trying to memorize, just it's more efficient to, again, learn 100 words, 85% comprehension, and spend 5 minutes on it rather than 50 words and you spend an hour on it, right? Like it's about efficiency. You don't want to waste too much time in Anki, and so trying to nail down every single word, that can waste a lot of time. Like you can spend 50 or an hour every single day and be a huge waste of time. So 83% for cards that I'm just learning, and 90%, 89% is totally fine. Now, on top of lingua, so when I read through a text, I usually just read through it first and mine all the vocab I don't know. I put them into an Anki, make Anki cards, and then once I've done that once, I like to go back and reread the whole thing just to pick up, just to like actually read it fluidly. And then usually I've been doing a little bit of rereading as well, but I noticed that there's a little bit of diminishing returns with rereading for me personally. Like I find it kind of boring if I'm reading a chapter more than a couple times. So 2 or 3 times is kind of my max. So once I've read a chapter 2 or 3 times, it's time to just move on with my life. On top of that, I've also been watching YouTube as much as I can. Found in Antiquity by Carla Hurt. She's a Australian teacher of Latin. Wonderful, wonderful channel. She has lots of audiovisual content. One of the challenges of Latin is that there is no audiovisual content. I mean, less than 100 hours, probably less than 50 hours, like in existence. And that's like a drop in the ocean compared to like how much anime, Japanese anime, as an example, there is. Like it's challenging because you kind of have to learn through reading, and learning through reading a language is just inherently challenging because reading is inherently challenging. It's much more difficult than listening in general. I know that's maybe controversial, but listening, when you get good at it, it becomes very automatic, very unconscious, and it's very little energy. But even at the high levels of reading, I find it's still quite mentally taxing to read at a high level. But and with audiovisual content, it's very inherently comprehensible because it's typically part of a story. There's a lot of repetitive vocab. You once you get to know the characters, they say kind of the same things a lot, and so you can learn the language relatively efficiently and quickly just by like noticing the things that you notice the recurring expressions. Oh, I noticed that grammar thing. Oh, what is that? And then eventually you get it, and then the most frequent stuff you learn first, and then eventually the least frequent stuff just by binging TV and movies. But you can't do that with Latin, just because again there's like, I don't know what the exact number is, but in terms of actual audiovisual content of an actual story and a narrative, forget about like for like just pure entertainment, just like anything, even for learners, it's like probably at less than 50 hours, if maybe even less than that. So there's not much. Like again, found in Antiquity by Carla Hurt and Divus Magister Hurt. He does Minecraft videos in Latin. Wonderful channel as well. He's a teacher, I believe, and again, I've like watched almost all their videos. Is the problem, and it's like there's not much left. So it's like all I'm left is just reading out. Like podcasts and vlogs and stuff in Latin are great, but it's not quite the same thing because they're just inherently less comprehensible. Because even though you do get inflection and other things like that when people are talking, you don't get the visuals to reinforce the meaning. So like it's like, in a TV show, people walk up and say "wale," that means like hello, right? Like, or bonjour, or hello, or whatever language you're talking about. Hola, hola, hola. I don't know Spanish at all. And so like it's just inherently comprehensible, even if you're not even like thinking consciously about it. It's just like you're associated now with that word with people meeting each other, and you can do that with almost the entire language. But we just don't have that content in Latin. We don't have like, even if we had like 100 hours of a TV show or 200 hours maybe, that would be probably enough with enough repetition. That would be nice, but we just don't. And so you have to kind of learn through reading. But hopefully over time there'll be more content like that will be created. And if someone dubs 300 episodes of Pokemon, that would be extremely convenient for my purposes. But unfortunately, that's not the case. So other than YouTube, which again, there's not that much out there. There's some supplements that are part of the Lingua Latina family, so Colloquia Personarum, which are kind of like little conversations, sort of like little stories that take place between the chapters of the main textbook. So you read chapter 1, and then you read chapter 1 from the first conversation from this book, and then you go back and forth. And so it uses the same vocab and grammar, and it just sort of reinforces some of the ideas through a slightly different story. And it's good. I honestly probably like most of these stories better than the main textbook, I would say. So yeah, I'm almost done though, because there's only 25 chapters, so I'm just about done that. And then there's also, once they're done chapter 25, there's a whole book of Greek and Roman mythological stories, called Fabulae Surae, which are stories of Surae, I think that's the slave and their family. And yeah, they're just like stories, I guess, of adaptations of myths, Roman myths, Greek myths, which is cool. So I'll probably do that after I finish those. And again, just the more I read, the more I listen to Latin, the better I'll get. So that's cool. And also, I found a Septimus, which some people talk about this like this is like a long lost reader of Latin with it's about a boy who travels back in time and discovers Roman civilization. People like have talked about it like, oh, it's this long lost reader that doesn't exist on the internet. I mean, I just found it. I found it on Zed Library. Like it wasn't that hard. So maybe I'll leave a link in the description. But it seemed pretty cool. Like people talked about it, like it's a good story. And even just looking at the very first page in Latin, there's like sort of a beginning in English. Just flip down. Even just like reading these first few sentences. Again, I'm not right at the point to actually be reading this book yet because I want to finish Familia Romana first. But even just like those first couple sentences, it feels pretty comprehensible. I think I understand it. Now, I'm sure it gets more complicated, and I'm sure there's lots of vocab that I don't know in it, but looking at it, it's just like, it doesn't seem that bad. It seems pretty comprehensible enough at least to learn from, that's for sure. If I look up words, make Anki cards. So I'm excited to finally get through Lingua Latina, Persa Illustrata, Familia Romana, the conversations, Colloquia Personarum, and Fabulae Surae. And there's also another one called Fabulae Latinae, which are just, again, sort of similar to Colloquiae Personarum. They're just sort of the same stories in the original textbook, but just sort of rewritten, I guess, is my best, and in sort of a different way, and covers the first 35 chapters, so I'll probably read through that as well. And then, so yeah, ideally I get through that all in this month, ideally. It's kind of ambitious, I guess, but again, I'm not here to master Latin in these texts. This is just enough vocab and grammar so I can start reading these readers and eventually like authentic texts, Julius Caesar, Cicero, Cicero, and other, I know some of these are harder than others, but ideally start finding authentic Latin for Latin speakers, or native Latin for native Latin speakers, so that I can start actually learning the language. Like when the safe, comfortable textbook Latin is not the same as real Latin. I am sure it's the same as in French, like the stuff you learn. There's so much in the French language that you only can learn in the wild. You can't really learn in a textbook. So I would just want to blast through this textbook, blast through some of these early things, and then just start doing all these Latin readers and eventually real authentic text. Try and find the easiest ones. But yeah, there's like Septimus ad Alpes, and if you go to Google Books and just type in Latin reader, you'll find a bajillion of them as well. So there's tons that have been made for learners. So I don't, I can't say I'm necessarily loving the beginner process, like getting your foundation of vocabulary and grammar. Like, it's not the most, like, the novelty is like, I don't love it. The novelty is more going to be when I get to that early intermediate level where I can actually start reading text and understanding it as a story. Like, that'll be interesting, and I think I'll enjoy that. But some of these chapters are a little bit of a slog. I can't say I necessarily love Familia Romana. Like I said, I find the story kind of boring, and I don't necessarily agree with the structure of it, but it's working. I think I'm making a lot of progress. I'm learning a lot. I'm getting better every day. I'm trying to incorporate Latin as much as I can in my everyday life. Like I said, I'm going at I think a decent pace, but I have other responsibilities and a job and etc. So there's only so much Latin I can do in one day. Yeah, at the end of next month, ideally, I'll probably make another video, but at the end of next month, ideally I'd be finished Familia Romana. Might be a little ambitious, but we'll see. And finish Colloquia Personarum, and finish Fabulae Surae, and Fabulae Latinae. Ideally, I'd finish that all by the end of next month, so then I can finally start Septimus and other ad Alpes and other Latin readers is the goal. So we'll see if I get there, but so far so good. I'm enjoying the process. Can't wait to improve and get better and start reading some cool things. But if you have any questions, if you have any thoughts or questions or ideas, I probably won't share my Anki deck, just because it probably won't be that beneficial to you anyways, because I'm kind of pulling it out of sentences that I understand and choosing only the words that I think will be beneficial for me to learn. So you can probably find a vocabulary deck for Lingua Latina on Anki Web if you want to. But yeah, any questions, let me know, and goodbye.